In this video, I'm going to cover how I use two lights to create these high-speed sync portraits and why I use these 10-pound counterweights for these pictures. Let's go ahead and cover todo el pedo. To start, the weather conditions is what dictated the equipment we were going to be using for this shoot. We were going to be shooting at the gorgeous location Sal del Rey, but on this day we had over 20-mile-per-hour winds. And the spot that we were going to be shooting in, it takes about a mile to actually walk to the spots we were going to be focusing on. And so we couldn't really bring all the equipment we wanted. So we had to bring limited gear. Knowing we were going to have those strong winds, I figured smaller modifiers to combat the wind, but also heavy duty C-stands. It was just going to be me and my friend Marco. We weren't going to have any assistants to help us hold stands. So that is one of the main reasons why we used those 10-pound Manfrotto counterweights. It's a great alternative opposed to sandbags, because as you know with sandbags, you run the risk of them spilling sand and tearing. And so these 10-pound counterweights are great because they simply just lock in and tighten to the C-stand. And as you can see in this location, it also included water. So not only do we have strong winds and we have water, those two really don't mix well when it comes to strobes. We couldn't afford for our gear to fall down. So these Manfrotto counterweights really came in the clutch. And one tip when you're faced with strong winds is to embrace it. So on this photo shoot, I asked my friend Marco, let's go to Hobby Lobby and let's look for some red fabric, because we knew there was going to be strong winds. And typically when we have strong winds here in Texas, I'm always tempted to cancel the photo shoot. But on this day, I was like, you know what, let's embrace it. Let's get this red fabric so that we can add some motion to the portrait. So instead of just having the subject stand there, let's give the hand something to do. She can hold this red fabric. Because of the strong winds, of course, this fabric is going to be moving, and we add this nice, beautiful motion to the photograph. And this also helps because this gives the hand something to do. A lot of times when we're posing, sometimes we can get stuck with, well, what do I do with the hands and how do I kind of direct the subject? Give the hand something to do, and that's going to help alleviate some of the stress when you're trying to set up the base for your pose. With that said, when you're creating a high-speed sync photograph, the goal is to get your ambient exposure first. So when I'm doing high-speed sync, usually the two settings that I assign first is my ISO. If I'm outdoors, ISO 100 stays locked in. The aperture is going to be dependent on how much depth of field that I want. Since I'm in this gorgeous location, Sal del Rey, I chose aperture 2.5 so I can have a little bit more depth of field so I can capture that beautiful golden hour sunset. Now the shutter speed is a secret ingredient here. This is what's going to determine how dark or bright my background is going to be. And so for this specific location, I was at shutter speed 5,000. And if we look at this example, notice how I'm adjusting the shutter speed, and as I'm increasing it, notice how the background starts to get darker. So your shutter speed is going to be different depending on the available light that you have at your specific location. Once I have my ambient settings locked in, now it's time to add fill light. As we look at this photograph, you can see that the subject is completely dark, and this is where I need to add my strobe, which in this case I was using the Westcott FJ400 with the 36-inch Octa box, and I placed this camera left about 45 degrees to the subject to fill light on those shadows. And in order to control the shadows on the unlit side of the face, I added another strobe with a 26-inch Octa box to brighten up those shadows. As we take a look at the final results from this first photograph, the lens choice played an important role. And I was using the Sigma 35mm, and this lens is my favorite because it's my environmental portrait lens. I'm able to include the location, and especially when you're in a beautiful location like Sal del Rey and you have an amazing sunset like we did on this day, I want to highlight that. I want to showcase it. And also, we had the fabric, we were going to have that motion, so this allows me to capture all of that beautiful movement as well as the location. Now that I captured my environmental portrait, I wanted to get a completely different look, so I switched to my Sigma 85mm to get that compression and also to get that beautiful bokeh. And right around when I decided to switch to the 85mm, the setting had completely changed. We were in blue hour now, we weren't in golden hour anymore, so my ambient settings had completely changed. So remember, step one is to get my ambient exposure. I knew I wanted to blur out the background, so aperture 1.4. We're still outdoors, so ISO 100. So now I just need to figure out the shutter speed. And the shutter speed, remember, as I increase it, it darkens the background. The lower it goes, the more light I let in. So for this specific example, my settings were locked in at 1.4, ISO 100, and shutter speed 2000. And to keep things simple, because we were running out of time, I kept the lights in the exact same light position. The cross lighting with the key light camera left, in front of the subject about 45 degrees, and my rim light behind the subject about 45 degrees, camera right, to add that beautiful separation. As far as the pose, I use that fabric once again. Instead of now creating motion with it, Ruth then decided to create a dress out of the fabric. And so that was a cool way of getting two different looks with that fabric. Getting the one with the motion, and then now getting one where it almost looks like a dress where she's wrapping it around herself. And let me know in the comments, which photograph do you prefer? The 35mm look or the 85mm? Before we get into Photoshop, I do have a confession to make. If I could recreate this photograph, I would much rather use a reflector as my rim light, because this doesn't catch wind as easily. You'll notice here the Octa S, because the wind's coming in the direction, it was capturing a lot of the wind and it was causing the stand to tip over at times. Even though I'm using that 10-pound Manfrotto counterweight, it did fall over. Luckily I did catch it though, so good catch on my end. But I would much rather use a reflector next time to prevent the light from falling over. Now let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop quickly, and let's look at the post-processing from beginning to end. Before we move on, I do want to talk about today's video sponsor, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions come together to take their next step in their creative journey. Skillshare offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative people on topics including photography, productivity, business, and more. Make great use of your downtime and check out Skillshare's online classes, which include a combination of video lessons and class projects. The class that recently inspired me was Portrait Photography Essentials One Light Setups by Justin Bridges. And I had told you guys about a month ago that I was going to start applying some of these techniques into my work, especially the butterfly lighting. And if you look at my most recent work, I've been obsessed with the butterfly light setup in my portrait photography. So if you're looking for something to ignite your creativity, Skillshare is a perfect resource to get that started. The first 1,000 people who use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare Premium. Now that we're in Photoshop, let's quickly look at the skin retouching. And for skin retouching, I use a combination of frequency separation and dodge and burn. So let's look at the before and then the after. If you want in-depth tutorials on how I do that, I have 2 tutorials on my YouTube channel. Now let's look at the color grading, which I use a combination of selective color and color balance. I also liquefied a part of the fabric to make it feel more like a dress. So you'll see that I push it in just ever so slightly to add a nice curve also to the body. Then I did a dress fix. You'll notice here at the top, the original dress was showing up. I wanted to cover that, so I clone stamped parts of the fabric to make it feel more believable. And then for my final adjustments, I added some final colors. So let's take a look at the overall before and after. Let me go ahead and hold Alt here. So before, and then the after. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have plenty of editing tutorials on my YouTube channel. Now let's go ahead and recap the final photographs. And remember, the high-speed sync process is you get your ambient exposure first. ISO 100 because we're outdoors. You decide your aperture, how much depth of field do you want in your image. And the secret ingredient is that shutter speed. How dark or bright do I want the background to be? So we get the ambient exposure. Let's compare that to the final photograph when I add my strobe light with the 35mm. And now let's take a look at the 85mm shot where I get my ambient exposure, and then I add my fill light with my strobes to get the final results. Let me know in the comments which photograph you guys prefer, the 35mm or the 85mm. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.